Hey, what's going on? My name is Brian Pickowicz. I'm one of the head coaches of the Fitness Project, and today we're going to be talking about how to better manage your anger. Now, this is a podcast that I wanted to share as I've been having a few different discussions about anger and also some realizations that I've had in the recent days and months. And I want to be transparent, and the ultimate goal is that this conversation is incredibly valuable. And I hope that through sharing some of the experience that I've had, some of the lessons I've had over the last 6 to 10 years of learning how to process my anger, learning how to better manage my state, and some other discussions that I've had over the last few years with different experts, that this is useful to you. Now, I'm doing a deep dive podcast as a result of a few different realizations that I've had, but really over the last, I'd say 7 to 10 years, just in different waves and different experiences, I've been really learning how to better manage my state and really learning how to better manage my emotions. I've dealt with chronic anxiety and, more namely, a lot of chronic anger and rage problems. And I think that sometimes when we think of these emotions, we think that they're a part of who we are. We feel like they're a part of who we are. And from my experience and different things that I've learned over the years, it's just a pattern and a habit. And so when we start to break apart the pattern and we start to break apart the habit, we gain our control and our strength back. So I hope that this deep dive is useful. I'm going to share 5 different steps that you can walk through on your own. And I'm going to also talk about some different realizations that have brought this to the forefront. But I think that the first piece as you're listening to this is understanding that the first step to changing any behavior or any pattern or any habit is to first become aware of it. Now, you might be aware that you're angry, but you might not be aware of the triggers, the sensations, and why you behave the way you do. Now, I want to be mindful. I am not a psychologist. These are different experiences that I've had. I am a mindfulness and meditation practitioner, so a lot of the ability to separate myself from my emotions comes from that background of mindfulness. But a lot of the different pieces that you'll see show up here are very similar to understanding how to better work through any given habit. And so again, when we want to change a habit, we have to first become aware of it. The second step is deciding that you actually want to change. And so if you become aware of a pattern, if you become aware of a habit, the second part is deciding if you want to change the way you approach it. And I think that that choice isn't a one size or one moment that says, okay, I'm going to change this and it's always going to be the way that I want it to be. It's a constant process. It's a constant practice, but we can begin to shift the way that we're dealing with it by building that desire to change. Now, that kind of leads us to the third point, where it is a practice. And so a lot of these points that we're going to talk about today, you might build awareness around, you might have the desire, and you still might find yourself falling back to your old ways. It's really important that we see the growth. We see that we're getting 1% better every day. And just in recognizing that you have a short fuse, the ultimate goal is to lengthen that fuse. It's to get to the point where you can better manage your state or reduce the amount of time that you're living in that state. And so these are 3 helpful pieces as we're diving in. But I want to share more about the context around my anger, because I always had a belief that it was a superpower. I've always had this belief that anger gives me strength, it gives me focus, it gives me intensity. And the truth is that it does give me those things. That's part of the way that we're wired, right? Anger is the ability to push through discomfort, and many times it does give us strength in the moment. But it's a corrosive energy, especially when it starts to bleed into other areas of your life. And so this conversation really came to a head because there was a challenge that Lindsey and I were facing in our business recently, and I started to get angry. I said, I got to solve this from a state of anger. And my exact words were something along the lines of, if there's a problem in my life, I use anger as the fuel to remove the problem. And for me, anger has been a superpower. And Lindsey looked at me and she said, why do you believe this gives you power when it causes so much pain and destruction along the way? And I thought, that's a really interesting insight. right? So this belief that I had been speaking over myself was in fact not true, because the evidence was counter to my current belief, which is I believe it gives me power. She sees that it causes pain. She sees that it causes chaos. So maybe there's something to examine here. And then I went to Tony Robbins' Unleash the Power Within event, and a lot of that experience at the event is understanding your negative patterns, understanding your negative emotions, understanding how your beliefs around those emotions and those patterns is causing you to not hit your target. And I thought it was a really insightful experience, which I might share more about in the future. But I wanted to bring this up because that event in this conversation kind of brought all these different experiences I've had over the years to this point. And the point that I realized was, oh, it's not a superpower, it's actually a crutch. And I'm going to talk about how I got to the point where I thought it was a superpower, how I got to the point where I built this positive association, how I managed anger, and then talk about some of the different things that I've learned over the years and how to maybe look at yourself and examine your own patterns of anger. So the first thing that I realized as I was doing some reflection and journaling is that the first step in changing the way that we handle anger is to examine the pattern in the story. And so for me, a lot of my anger started as a child. And I think that if you look at a lot of different research in psychology, psychologist Gabor Mate is probably the best example that you can start digging into. A lot of how we experience anger is just a reflection of how we experienced it or suppressed it as children. And so for me, I was bullied tremendously as a child. I was in this school in a really small town where a lot of the families were all together for a while. And I was this new kid and I didn't fit in. A lot of them rode dirt bikes or were into the woods, and I played sports and liked Batman and Dragon Ball Z and like action figures. And when I went to school from the time of, let's say, kindergarten to 5th grade before I hit a growth spurt, I was bullied tremendously. It was a really painful experience. I remember, like, if I think about my childhood, every time I went out to recess, it was a fight. And I was this really loving kid. I had a great family life, so it didn't reflect my reality of what I was raised with people who were loving and kind, to go to school where everyone was violent and rude, and many days you didn't know who was going to be your friend and who was going to pick on you. And I even have these memories of there was a fence, and I would almost back myself against the fence because the kids would crowd around me and they would all take their turn at beating me up or saying mean things or whatever. And this created a lot of resentment and sadness. But then I remember one day, my grandfather told me a story. And he said, when your uncle dealt with that as a kid, I taught him, he never told me to do this, so I apparently got the cross-examination or the cross-pollination of the story. But he said, I told him the next day that kid does something to you, you grab your fist and you punch him as hard as you can in the face. And that was how I dealt with it. So I remember going to school one day, there was this new kid, and apparently, I don't know if it was just because I was the weakest one and it worked its way into the culture, or it was the energy I was putting off, but this kid was new at school, and he ran at me. And I just remember just punching him in the face, and he fell down. And I was like, whoa. Like, I created a new result as a byproduct of how I handled the anger, and he didn't pick on me. So that was kind of the first experience of taking anger and turning it into something productive, because then I didn't get bullied. And it got worse from there. So like the experience that I had was there was this kid who was chaos. I know now, and I learned in the coming years, he came from a really poor family. There was a lot of abuse in the family. And I was friends with him at that one point. And the way that my mom explains the story is he had been friends with me, and then he decided to one day just destroy like all these sand castles or these snow castles we had made. It must have been snow because it was winter. And I think my mom says that you decided that you didn't want to be friends with him. And I told you that it was okay. From that point forward, that kid made it his mission to pick on me. And it was not fun. It was a really bad experience. And I remember in this time after I'd learned that first lesson of using anger and fueling it and having a violent response, this kid came up behind me. His name was John, and he tried to grab something out of my hands, and he like hit me in my groin. And I just remember as a young kid, I think I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, I turned around and just beat the hell out of him. Broke his nose. I got kicked out of school for 2 weeks, but my parents were like, hey, if you don't do something about this, this is going to get really bad for Brian. This kid isn't learning his lesson. How can we help him? Do we have to put him in counseling? Like, what can we do? And when I came back to school 2 weeks later, he had brought a knife to school, and he brought bullets. He didn't bring a gun, but he brought a knife to school to try to kill me. And I remember, I can still see the image in my mind. One of the students had told the teacher, like, hey, Jonathan has a knife. And Jonathan had taken the knife out, and the teacher went to go and, like, get the knife, and he threw it at her. Didn't hit her, but that was kind of the experience. So I have this experience as a young kid with handling anger, and at such a young age, I didn't know what to do with this all. And they tried to put me through therapy. We didn't get much out of that. And then my mom put me in sports. And this is where I really started to build a positive association to anger, because when I was angry, I performed better. And I remember there's these different experiences I had where I just started to feel all this anger. I had practiced pitching. And I told one of the coaches, like, hey, like, I've been practicing my pitching. I'm really excited. If I could pitch, it'd be really great. He's like, you know what, I'll put you in the day. And I think it was the last game of the season, and he didn't pitch me. And I just remember this rage at like 10 or 11 years old. Just I decided at that moment I was going to be really great, and I was going to stick it to him next year. So I started practicing. And my brother was already a really great pitcher, so we started to practice together. And then when I took the field that next year, I realized that if I was losing, I threw much harder when I was angry. And so as an athlete, if I threw harder, I got more strikes. I won more games. And this became wired in my psychology that when I'm angry, I can use that. And I used this all the way through my middle school, my high school. In high school, my senior year, I was the player of the year for New Hampshire, and I was a dominant pitcher. And most of it was because of my psychology. It wasn't because I was better. It was because of my psychology. I knew how to get myself in state and dominate. So you have this pattern of anger that served you, right? And I imagine that if you're listening to this, you might have a pattern of anger that served you in some way. It's probably kept you safe. It's maybe allowed you to not feel small. Whatever it is, it's worth examining how your pattern has served you. What is the pattern and how to get you here? Now, for me, it even got more intensified when I got into bodybuilding. I went from someone who had never been in the gym, had never lifted weights. In the first 2.5 years of training, I went from just being an average athlete, so I could have probably deadlifted around 200 pounds. 2.5 years, I was deadlifting almost 600 pounds. I had tapped into that rage. And there was other examples of things that were painful in my life that I was tapping into. But I had learned how to channel it. Now, it was a real success pattern. When I go to the gym, I get myself into this state and then I channel it. And it worked. Now, what happens when you're not an athlete? What happens when that's your pattern and you bring that to other experiences in your life? I started to see that show up in business. I started to see that show up in my relationship, to the point where Lindsey looked at me one day and said, if you don't change this, I can't be with you anymore. And so this is really where the experience of changing that pattern shows up. So I wanted to share this because that's the first step, is examining the pattern and examining the anger. The second thing after that moment that Lindsey said, hey, you need to change this, I had to start examining it. The second step is examining where you learned it from. So I was sitting in this, I had this great meditation and mindfulness practitioner. She's been on our podcast. Her name's Sumeda. who I worked with extensively through this pattern. And so we were sitting with this, and she said, where did you learn how to become angry? And I realized I had some really great examples. So in psychology, there's a term called observational learning, and it posits that people learn new information and behaviors by watching and imitating others. So there's this really great study done by the psychologist Albert Bandura, and it was in the 1960s, and it's known as the Bobo doll experiment. So the objective of the experiment was primarily to investigate whether children would imitate aggressive behaviors they observed from adult models. And so what they did is they took this group of children, boys and girls, and they had two different experiences. They put this doll in a room, and they had the children watch different experiences of how people interacted with the doll. So they had an aggressive model where the kids saw an example of adults hitting the doll, pushing it over, punching it. And they had an experience of non-aggressive behavior where they just went up to it, they maybe saw it, they didn't really engage with it, and then they had an experience where there was no stimulus at all. But what they saw is that the kids who observed the angry adults, the punching, the pushing, the violence, whatever it was, those children were more likely to do the same thing when they got into the room with the doll. And a lot of different experiences, findings are that the way that we show our emotions are the models that we saw growing up. So there's this really great quote from that psychologist Albert Bandura. People learn not only from direct experience, but also from observing others. Many behaviors are acquired by observing models, and one of the most effective sources of models is other people's behavior, especially of our significant others, whether it's our parents, our siblings, our friends, and our admired people. And so one of the questions that I went through after I recognized that this was a pattern that I'd learned as a child because of the way that I was, surviving essentially through that experience, was also the models that I had. And one of the best examples of modeling was from my grandfather. And I love my grandfather. He's recently passed over the last couple of years ago. And I had a really profound relationship with him. But as I also started to learn more about his life, it made sense the reason why he behaved the way he did. And I remember hearing stories about him getting angry and punching holes in walls. I remember hearing stories about him throwing things out the window, and he had this pattern of anger. And in different ways, I saw that show up from time to time. My dad had some similar anger issues that manifested in his life, and those were things that I learned. And so a lot of times, the way I spoke when I was angry wasn't my own language. One of the experiences I had was I was sitting there one time, and there was this thing that happened, and I heard myself say, well, I'm fucking pissed off. And I stepped back for a moment and I examined, well, what was I actually feeling? Was I actually pissed off or was I just upset? And I was like, wow, well, where did that come from? And I heard one of my parents' voice. I was like, so this pattern, this way of speaking is not my speaking, it's someone else's. So I was modeling it. And I think that it's helpful to start to examine the stories of where we learn to model our behavior. So for me, it was modeling after my grandfather, after my father, or even after my mother, as she, had her own challenges because she's a human, right? It's not nothing against those people, but just understanding that this is something I learned. And so if I can learn it from someone, I can also learn a new pattern. I can learn a new behavior. And so that was a really insightful piece as I was walking through this journey. Okay, I discovered why I was the way I was. I discovered why I modeled the behavior. And then from there, I started to branch into the third step, which was examining my identity around it. And so when I thought of my identity around anger, I was sitting with Sumeda in this experience, and we're meditating, we're working through these patterns, and I'm just learning how to process anger. And I spoke this over myself. I said, I'm just an angry person. I am just an angry person. It was an identity. Just like, anger is a superpower, is a belief. So this identity of I am an angry person means that I can rationalize my behavior because it's just a part of who I am. And one of the most powerful things she said to me was, it's not that you're an angry person. It's that you are a human who experiences the emotion of anger. You are a human who experiences the emotion of anger. That's a normal part of being a human, is our experiences of emotions. But it's not a part of who you are. So if you want to change this pattern, you have to start to change your language around it. So one of the things I'm really mindful of is I don't label emotions as a part of me. I don't even label different identities as a part of me, really. Like if I'm struggling with an emotion, I don't say, well, I'm feeling sad. I say, I'm experiencing the emotion of sadness. And what that does is it allows me to reframe the current experience I'm having so I can find a more positive behavior through it. So these few different examples, maybe one is starting to examine your own story, understanding how to experience or understand maybe some of your models, but then also starting to identify the beliefs that keep you stuck, the beliefs that keep you in that pattern of anger. Is it an emotion or is it part of who you are? If it's a part of who you are, it's going to be hard to change because you're going to keep fighting for it. We will continue to fight for our identities. The way we identify with a problem is oftentimes the way that we start to think about solving it. So if someone says, I am a stress eater, well, they're going to find themselves stress eating because that's a part of who they are. I'm an angry person. I'm a loving person. We fight for our identities. So changing the way you identify with your emotions and changing the story around it is a really helpful step for starting to distance yourself from them. So these are all roots, right? We're examining the roots and we're getting out of it. But once I understand the roots, it's like, oh, I still have these cycles. I still have these patterns. And that's where I think it's more practical in the here and now. What do you do? So one of the things that I've done over the last few years is really examine the psychology of habits. Great books to read on habits are The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. If you want to understand more about your emotional habits, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself by Dr. Joe Dispenza. And then a lot of people have heard us reference Atomic Habits by James Clear. If you read these three books in unison, you're going to understand a tremendous amount about your own habits and how people are, right? Because you'll start to see these different things manifest. But for me, the third step was observing the cycle that I was in. So every habit has a cue. There's a craving, there's a response or an action, and then there's a reward. The ultimate goal of every habit is the reward that we get from it. So if you think about anger, the reward is feeling powerful, which more often than not is not feeling weak, right? So for me, I don't want to feel weak. I don't want to feel defeated. So when I start to feel low or defeated, my brain kicks on and says, no, we don't want this. We don't want to feel small. We don't want to feel like we can be taken advantage of. Kind of going back to another reference, Gabe Mate talks about anger is a response to our boundaries being transgressed upon. So when we have our boundaries pressed upon, anger kicks in and we push back. And that's a healthy response. But when we think of the reward cycle, it's understanding that there is a reward to anger, but there's also a cue and a response. So if we can start to examine, okay, first, what are the triggers? What are the things that trigger my anger? What is the feeling inside my body, the urge, the craving, the feeling that comes with it? Then what do I typically do? The more you can start to see that cycle play out, the more you can choose a new response. There's a really great quote from psychologist Viktor Frankl. If you've ever read Man's Search for Meaning, you understand how powerful the teachings of logotherapy are, which is essentially deciding what meaning you're going to give to an experience. But Viktor Frankl was a survivor of Auschwitz and the Holocaust. He was also a therapist and a psychologist who went through that experience. So he was able to examine what led him to survive based off of his psychology and what allowed other people to survive based off their psychology versus others who gave up. And it was all about meaning. And so his quote is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So the first thing to examine is almost building your own habit cycle of how you handle anger. I found it really to be useful to see the triggers, right, the things that happen, but more importantly, to examine my body. what does my body do when I'm in anger? One of the movements I have, my first response is to get big. Well, if I'm getting big and my voice is starting to go up, it's a good sign that whatever is about to come is not going to be that productive. It's not going to be that fruitful. So again, I can start to examine the cycle of my body. One of the first places to look is, what is your neck like when you're in anger? Where's your breathing like? Where's your jaw? What do you do with your hands? I have this client that I'm working with on changing some of his patterns and teaching him these mindful techniques. And I'm like, okay, I want you to put yourself into a state of anger. And I'm like, okay, what do you notice? He's like, the first thing I notice is I clench my hands. I'm like, okay, so the really great thing to start doing is changing the response in your body. Because when we're in a heightened state, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, it's coursing through our body because we're getting ready to fight. And so what we want to do is we want to bring our body back to homeostasis. The easiest way to do that is to breathe. So if I notice I'm in the cycle of anger, I'm really feeling it, first thing I'm going to do is observe the pattern, or I need to build the awareness around it, and then I'm going to breathe. So Andrew Huberman talks about two-sided inhale breath and then an audible exhale. Easiest way to bring yourself down from stress. So if you're in that stress response, if you're in that anger response, breathing in twice, then breathing out. Breathing in twice, breathing out. This is a helpful way to start bringing your body back down. Bringing your body back down to its normal levels of cortisol, adrenaline. Bringing yourself back down to homeostasis. So I can start to see this cycle. I can start to see my body. And then I can start to change the way that I'm experiencing it. So again, this is a process that's going to take a lot of practice. You don't just show up and magically fix it. It's an everyday thing. It's an every experience thing. But if I can observe the cycle, I can change the response. And it's consistently taking a new response that changes our pattern. Charles Duhigg talks about the golden rule of habit change is to take a new action, right? You can't always change the cue. I can't help when someone cuts me off in traffic. I can't help when something blows up in the business. It's going to happen, right? I can't even change how my body feels because I've programmed myself to do this for years. I can change the response. So again, the goal is just to get 1% better. If I can start changing it day by day slightly, then it works really well, right? I can start to change that pattern. And the more I become aware of, the more I become aware of, right? Because I start to see it show up in different ways. So again, examining the story, examining the modeling, examining the cycle or the beliefs around it, and then examining the cycle. And then the last step is choosing a new response. It's taking a new action and starting to practice the behavior that you want. Now, when talking about changing your response or changing your actions, again, we have to understand that anger is a healthy response. Anger is a response to our boundaries being transgressed upon. The key is understanding that if you're handling your emotions or handling anger in an unhealthy way, that's when you need to continue to look at this more thoroughly. And so, again, for me, the way that I've trained myself to change the pattern, I breathe through it. I change my breath. I breathe through it. I relax my body. I change my body. The body tells me what's happening unconsciously. And then from there, I can start to change the way I'm processing the emotion. Now, there is a helpful framework that I found from psychologist Tara Brach. The framework is RAIN. So recognize what's happening. Allow yourself to feel the emotion. Allow yourself to feel the experience. Feel your body. Bring your awareness to your body. Investigate it. Investigate. And I'll talk about how I investigate, and that might be a useful experience and example. But investigate the emotion. And then lastly, nurture yourself. Give yourself what you need in that moment. Now, one of the things I learned a few years ago was that oftentimes anger is a response to disappointment. It's a response to feeling disappointed that something's not going the way that you want. It's a response to feeling that your capacity is not going to be able to meet the demand that's placed on you, and that feels like a loss. Right? So again, as an athlete, I learned, I'm disappointed. I'm not winning the game. And that really upset me. And so I get angry and focus myself, and that would always lead to a positive outcome. Now, it doesn't always produce a positive outcome in your relationship, I'll tell you that much, right? So again, understanding that if I'm in an experience with Lindsey and I get angry, right? The first thing I'm going to do is recognize the pattern, recognize that I'm feeling angry, recognize what's happening in my body. The second thing is I'm going to allow myself to feel it. I'm not going to allow myself to react, but I'm going to allow myself to feel it. And the third piece is investigating with curiosity-based questions. So one of the questions that I use is, what am I actually angry about? Am I angry that we missed the sale? Am I angry that one of our employees messed up something? Am I angry that she left the kitchen a little bit of a mess? Right? And what am I actually angry about? Am I more angry or disappointed in the fact that that problem still exists? Am I more angry or disappointed that we don't have someone who cleans the house and I didn't do a good job cleaning it myself? What am I actually disappointed about? What am I actually angry about? So I have to examine the roots to bring awareness to the sensation, right? And because that stops me from overreacting towards someone else and lashing out. So if I can examine and investigate, what am I actually upset by? I can start to talk through it. And so that's kind of the nurturing process that I work through. So a small example might be something happens, Lindsey and I have an interaction, and I start to notice I'm really angry. I stop, I experience it, and then nurturing, right? Once I've investigated the roots, is I nurture by expressing what I'm actually feeling. And sometimes this whole process is a practice. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience with yourself and grace with yourself. You have to treat yourself like someone you want to see improve. For myself, a lot of times it might be, I'm just really disappointed that we didn't do that. I'm just really frustrated that the house is a mess and I haven't been able to clean it yet. And I'm not even disappointed or upset that the house is a mess. I'm upset about this thing that just happened, and I'm just using this as a reason to lash out at someone. That's where vulnerability is a superpower, and it takes practice. But again, if I can recognize the experience, I can allow myself to feel it. I can investigate the experience of what I'm actually feeling versus what I think I'm feeling, right? What's the thing that's lingering in my unconscious mind that's right below the surface? And then I can start to nurture or take a new step to change the outcome. That's really all we're doing. We're not trying to change the emotion as much as we're trying to change the outcome, because anger doesn't create good outcomes. It creates conflict. It creates resentment. Over years, it creates separation. It creates destruction. So it's a corrosive energy, especially if you allow it to fuel you. So these are just some helpful tactics. And I think that the key is understanding that if you start to work through this, you see a whole litany of examples of where you can improve and how you can change the pattern. So I want to tie this down. Anger is a pattern of response. It's an emotion. It's a part of being human. So when we start to examine ourselves and see that we are just humans who are experiencing this emotion, we can start to change the way that we feel by taking new actions. It's not just taking a new action like I breathe. It might also be taking a new action by journaling out your thoughts because you might not know how to examine them yet. It might be starting to see a psychologist or a mindfulness practitioner and having them walk you through the pattern that you're experiencing as well. I think that sometimes we think that we should be changing overnight, and that belief actually keeps us from making progress. This has been something I've been working on for almost a decade. It started by just learning to breathe, just sit with my thoughts in a meditation and see what was happening. It then led to doing more stress inoculation therapy, where I would sit with the negative emotion and observe my body, observe what was happening in my mind, observe the feeling of anger. And then through that awareness of observing the pattern in my body, I was able to start taking new actions to change the pattern. It takes time. So I think giving yourself grace and recognizing where you're at is a really important piece of this journey. But I think if you can start to examine what are your beliefs around it, where did this start? Where did you model it? What's the current story that's holding you back? What's the cycle? What's the pattern? And then what are the new actions you're going to take, especially starting with your physiology? If you can lay that out and then have someone on the other side, like a loved one, a practitioner, a coach, someone who's going to help you, you start to see the pattern work through a more productive means of action. And that's really what it's all about. It's not about being a different person overnight. It's about developing a new habit, a new way of being. And if you can do that, I think it'll really serve you. So I hope this is helpful. It's a deep dive. A lot of the different points I referenced, I will make sure are queued up in the show notes. And again, I hope that this is just a useful tool. It's been a long journey for me. I still experience it. I still get angry, but I choose to not let it persist. I have a 90-second rule where I experience it, I allow it, I work through it, and then I change the response. It's not helpful, and I've learned that. There's consequences to it, and if you're listening up to this point, you've probably realized that too. So it doesn't matter, again, also if it's anger or another emotion, you can use this in that similar way. But if this was helpful or useful, I'd love to hear from you. It's a new style of podcast, new style of talk. So I'd love to hear your takeaways, what served you, what didn't serve you, just any different points. And more importantly, hope this is a helpful way for you to live a healthier life. Our emotions are a part of our life. It's a part of being healthy. Oftentimes the thing that keeps us from eating well, working out, having a healthy life. And so the more that we can examine them, the better we can be. So on that note, stay blessed, keep growing. Cheers.